Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So we're going to start the panel. We have moderator here in person, and we have a moderator Elena on Zoom, and they'll introduce themselves and the panel members.
Awesome, great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for attending the industry panel. So today we have really five fantastic panelists who will introduce themselves a little bit. But I'm Ichin, as you know. I talked this morning a little bit about myself, but I really want this panel to be interactive. We will ask some initial set of questions to the panelists over here and on Zoom, but we'll also have some time at the end for you to ask any questions you might have for our distinguished panelists as well. So with that, I will pass it on to Eli to start introducing themselves.
Thanks very much. Yeah, happy to be here. I guess by way of quick introduction, I know one of the first questions is sort of what path we took to get into industry. So I was originally a physicist in my PhD program and moved pretty quickly into computational biology. And what drew me in was a project that my advisor was involved in. The C4 rice project, which some of you may be familiar with, which is this interdisciplinary effort to re-engineer the photosynthetic pathway of rice to increase crop yields. And so from very early on, I was interested in those kinds of multidisciplinary biological engineering projects. I was peripherally involved in another one in my postdoc. And I found that it's often quite awkward to do those things in academic contexts. And that's, no knock on any of my collaborators. I was privileged to work with some of the best in the world in both plant science and synthetic biology. And their commitment to their project is deep and sincere. But I think many of them would agree that you're often sort of swimming against the tide in attempting to pull people from different disciplines together and really, make a new technology work in that framework. So I was very curious about how things looked from the industry side. Joined a microbiome startup in Cambridge as its third employee in 2017, and I've gone through a variety of positions in the industry ever since.
Hi, I'm Bora, and I'm a machine learning scientist at Shape. So a few years ago, I got my PhD here at UW, but I got it in electrical and computer engineering, and I was more focused on robotics. If you had told me at the time that I would end up at a gene therapy company, I wouldn't actually be surprised, to be quite honest, because my research was fairly unapplied. So after graduating, I worked at Amazon for a little bit over a year, and I kind of realized that probably wasn't a fit for me because although there was a lot of smart people there working on interesting things, I think the objective we were trying to optimize was just not a good use of time, perhaps. And, potentially I was motivated by some extent because my girlfriend has a rare genetic eye disorder, and believe it or not, her eye disorder was, I think, the first one that was treated, our first successful gene therapy clinical trial. I think it's called Luke's Trend or something like that. And I think that made me realize that gene therapy is a growing field and one that holds a lot of potential. And I think I just feel very lucky to be in this field right now. And I think I think that a lot of the times I tell people who are still in the more tech realm that feels like we're at the early days of the internet. I think it's going to play out a little bit slower, but I think we're figuring out how to reprogram ourselves, and I think it's going to have a lot of consequences. Hopefully, a lot of them are good.
Shall we turn it over to the folks on Zoom?
Babak, you can begin.
Sure, thank you. So should I just introduce or answer the first question as well?
Maybe introduce and talk about how you got into industry, which I guess.
Sure. So my name is Babak Ali Panahi. I am the CSO of ExciteBio, not CTO. It's okay. So I've done my PhD in CS, but I started as an electrical engineer who was building robots, etc. And one day I decided that I don't like that field anymore. Not to this, EE, but I retracted my admissions and I waited a year and applied to CS programs. And then I did my PhD with Mingley in Waterloo on protein structures, then moved to Toronto and, moved one step up in the dogma and started working on RNA with Brendan Fry and Ben Blanco. And the technology we created and the science became the foundation of a company called Deep Genomics, which does ASO therapies now. Continuing, going up the ladder, I joined 23andMe to work on genetics and AI models for disease risks. And then from there, I joined even one, step up and spend my time at Google Brain Genomics team on AI-based phenotyping. And, an idea that I see has got a lot of attention in the recent years. And after a couple of years at Google, I co-founded Excitebio with my all-time friend, Hani Gudarzi, who is a PI at UCSF. And, we are a liquid biopsy company using cell-free RNAs and AI to detect cancer early. So how did I get here? I would say, the best thing about industry for me is pace. I am not a patient person. I want to get results fast. And that's why, I like fast-paced environments that you can try many different ideas really quickly. Before going to, to the detail of my answer and, passing to Ikram, I will say that before leaving Google, around like 2020, I started a project, and that paper was published 3 years later. And some of the papers from projects that I started at Google, they haven't even been sent for review. I mean, I love it as a researcher. I love to have this on the side, but as a person, it kind of, the timelines are too long for the way I want to do things. I don't think, there is a right or wrong and there is any kind of preferred way. It's just, how people view and how they want to, go on with their research. And with that, I pass to Vikram.
Thank you. So first of all, I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be part of this extraordinary meeting. My name is Vikram. Just to start with like my beginnings a little bit, I completed my PhD in David Bartel's lab at the Whitehead Institute at MIT. And I was there from about 2009 to 2015. And back then I was really interested in using machine learning approaches to predict microRNA targets, interested in post-transcriptional gene regulation field. And after graduating, I moved to Seattle for a while at the University of Washington. I wish I could have been there in person again to experience it again, but for now it's virtual. But back then I was a postdoc working with Jay Shinduri in the Genome Sciences department. And then it was around 2015 and been seeing news reports about deep learning, and that really caught my attention. But not that many people had applied that back then to genomics. Actually, Babak was one of the first papers I read in that area, so it heavily inspired my work. But that was kind of that time period of a relatively nascent application of deep learning to genomics, and it really caught my interest and attention. I became passionate about applying that to slightly different problem of that of transcriptional gene regulation. And then as time evolved, I started seeing just amazing work going on in industry as well, especially research projects coming out in the deep learning ML AI space from tech industry. And that kind of drew my attention a lot. And I was really fascinated by that. And also saw in biotech, there were companies emerging that were increasingly doing scientific research, like Calico, Illumina, for example. And this led me to kind of join Calico, and that's where I worked with David Kelly for many years and collaborators at Google and DeepMind for the next 3 or 4 years. One of my final projects at Calico before leaving had to do with a project to predict RNA degradation rates. And I would say it wasn't exactly the hottest topic. Not that many people cared about this very particular niche area, but it was during the time of COVID, and we really saw the blossoming of amazing technologies for mRNA therapeutics coming from Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna really blowing up this field and demonstrating RNA as a new class of therapy. So I got increasingly enthusiastic about applying some of my work into that direction. And just so happened that Sanofi was entering that market and created a new division dedicated to RNA therapeutics and research and development in that area. And the time and place was right, so that's where I ended up hopping back. And that's where I am right now, and leading a team of maybe 9 people or so in the ML RNA therapeutics space. So that's kind of the trajectory of my journey overall. Thanks.
So going on to the next question, some of you touched on this a bit in the introduction, but I'm curious, what has surprised you most about research and industry versus academia? And what do you think are specific areas that people are more well suited to do in either one or the other environment?
Does either of our in-person speaker want to?
I can go for it, I guess. So I think at least it's becoming probably to some extent increasingly clear that I think industry is well suited towards working on problems that require a large amount of engineering or engineering science. So like building large machine learning models or pursuing some type of novel biotechnology. But I do think that academia kind of retains a distinct edge in trying high risk kind of curiosity driven research, because a lot of the time I find in companies that, especially smaller ones, that you're working towards a goal, trying to like get something into the clinic. And so usually the problems you're tackling is you're trying to enable something to get it to work well enough to get to the point that it can meet some type of objective. And so I think these different aims kind of facilitate different types of research.
Anyone on Zoom want to chime in?
Look,
All right, no one on Zoom seems to be. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was asking if either of you want to chime in if you didn't hear him.
Also on Zoom?
Yeah, if either of you.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
First time I went first, so this is you, Vikram. I will follow.
Okay, yeah. So I would say, yeah, one of the most important and amazing lessons I've learned in industry is just how many different ways there are to break a product from practical success. So just want to give you a concrete example of as I work in the vaccine industry, there's some amazing papers in top tier journals showing universal vaccines, but then could they actually work? There are actually many different ways to break that. So just to give an example, you might need to refrigerate that material at very cold temperatures. You might need to ship it long distances. The dose might be too large, so it might be too reactogenic, might be too cytotoxic. So there are just so many myriad ways to break a product. And I would say being in industry has really expanded my thinking into all these different nuances of engineering, and you have to get all of them right to design the best product. For example, if you're working in developing nations, they may not have good electricity infrastructure to store vaccines at cold temperatures. So these are the kind of real world challenges that limit applied science applications, and has really pushed me to think more deeply about engineering solutions in those cases. But in the flip side, I would also say that where academia might have the advantage is that they might have the luxury to work on high risk, high reward projects that require more long-term rigorous work on time spans that may be unsuitable for industry. So that could be one advantage of academia versus industry, but ultimately both of them are very crucial towards advancing therapeutics and these types of products. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so my take is that first of all, I want to tell people that I think our similarities are far more pronounced than our differences. This is my first position. Some of my friends, they joked, when I joined 23andMe that, oh, you are, moving to the dark side. There is no dark side, there is no light side. We are all scientists working toward, a really high level goal, and we want to make life better. We are in computational biology and focused on AI in medicine. So for me, honestly, the first change that happened, and I try to complement the other panelists' answers, not to repeat what they said, which are amazing points. I remember the first Friday, someone told me Happy Friday, and I was kind of shocked. I was like, what do you mean Happy Friday? And it turns out that people actually celebrate Fridays because they have weekends. I had a very prolific postdoc and I enjoyed it to the max, but I was working day and night. And, I started to appreciate evenings and weekends. And, I started reading books. I was, it was good to, continue my sci-fi reading a bit. So that was a great help. So not only for myself, but at places that I can make a change, I am trying to make that transition. So I am leading a team of like 30 scientists and engineers, and I really want them to have a lot of free time to, spend time on non-work activities. My view is that if you work 40 effective hours in industry and maybe in academia, you will be successful, and that's enough. Another factor, which maybe kind of alludes to the dark side, is compensation. I have to be honest with you, when I was a postdoc, life was hard. I was married and I had a kid, and you cannot deprive your kid, which means that you have to, cut from yourself and your well-being. And it was really hard. And I'm glad that at industry, I can provide and create an environment that people can be comfortable. I mean, it's Bay Area and no one can, be well off. It's impossible, but at least, they can feel confident about, their financial situation. My view, my objective is that the people who I'm leading at any point in time, this is the best place for them. And I think in academia, it's a similar thing because, you are being trained, your compensation is not as high, but the reward, the long-term reward could be really significant. But I think balancing it is hard. I think PIs in academia, they don't have as much leverage to reward, superstars or people who are really performing well. Which is something that, I would love to hear from, my academic friends in future. But I think like in the industry, you have more ways to make sure that your team is taken care of, both in terms of like their mental well-being and their future prospects.
Oliver, if you're done. I'll offer a couple of supplementary thoughts. I mean, I was really delighted to see some of the work earlier today on comparing the foundation model. Sorry, I was really glad to see earlier today a lot of the work on really, kicking the tires on the foundation models and asking if they're outperforming much simpler approaches. And I think that's something that's often neglected in academia. And I think that perhaps surprisingly, industry can be a good place to do that kind of thing because it's really just quite sensible, to carefully evaluate the performance of a new technique on an independent test before you start actually betting your project on it in any way. And in particular, like if you can find a way to replace something complex and expensive with a $2 calculation involving logistic regression, that is a fantastic win. 95% of the time, the other 5% of the time being in cases where, you really want to be talking about the complexity and sophistication of your technology, which is a separate story. Similarly, I've had good experiences doing projects in industry, which, where there was an opportunity to boost performance by just doing a lot of skilled, difficult technical work that wasn't particularly novel, right? And there's not a high profile publication that comes out of that, but often there's a lot of payoff. And that's something that I think can often be done in industry if you can make the case for it. And that's something where I think industry can often support the community as well. I guess the final thing that I'll say, sort of the flip side of the compensation question is like the attitude towards spending money, very different in industry. And not only in that the amounts that you're throwing around are often much larger, but, if you're faced with doing a $500,000 experiment to get a critical result, the right response is often, okay, but if we spent 10% more, could we get that sooner? Right. And that's not, I think, how many of us ever thought in the academic space. And it is a real adjustment, right? It's quite challenging.
Great, awesome. So it sounds like our panel has really great views about how academia and industry share their like similarities and differences across the research space. So the next question I have for the entire panel is, based on what you have I guess, worked on in both the research space in industry and academia, what are some of the best ways for academics to collaborate with their company? Those can be from the level of having an intern who work on research problems, but also extend to, say, for instance, a PI who's interested in leveraging some of the ideas and data that the company might be collecting.
I guess I'll go first. So actually, this is an interesting question. I saw a version of this when I was at Amazon. They had something called the Amazon Scholar, where they basically paid professors to come work there and consult. So that was one form I saw, and that's specifically tailored towards PIs. But that basically extends to postdocs and students because they could just go either intern or they had other programs that were like year-long fellowships. At a startup environment, it's harder to say. I think potentially there would be opportunities if there was some type of shared interest, some type of shared research. I know my advisor is currently funded by companies asking him to do some type of research that is useful to these companies. And then I would say like the most kind of natural collaboration I see on a day-to-day level for me is academic software. Anything that's put on GitHub and is used, I think is kind of a very natural way to collaborate, and I think serves both aims very well, both academic and industrial.
I can go next. We have multiple active collaborations with academia. I love the way academia can do high risk, high reward projects, and that's the beauty of it. We have a couple of SRAs with a few labs. So these are service research agreements that you kind of have a contract with the lab, and they will do an experiment and share the results with you. I think these are very prolific because usually when there is like some finding from the study, there's going to be a joint publication. I think having interns in the company is great. It's a great way to see whether you like industry or not. I highly encourage if there are any trainees to do an internship because it's gonna be a surprise. So when we hire scientists, the first week they're usually taken aback by the level of rigor we have for coding. And the code is going to be reviewed, and the code needs to be replicable, and it should be run 100 years from now in the same manner and reproduce the exact same results. You might not like it. You might decide that you want something that is more researchy, if that's a term. But overall, I think we have never had any issues with PIs. The problem is usually universities and the legal offices that we need to figure out. I think they are stuck in the past. So sometimes, we want to use tools from labs, and these are tools that my friends have made. Sometimes these are tools that I have made, and I want to use them, and I have to negotiate with my own university, and it takes such a long time that we just give up. I hope that, we can make this simpler, easier to do. And I think there is a lot to be gained from collaborations between industry and academia, in particular for really futuristic, high-risk projects that usually are, the most rewarding.
All right, I guess I can go next. I would say that now I'm in industry, I started to realize that many of the academic partnerships that I've built between Sanofi and academic partners were people I met earlier in my life at some point. So these are from prior universities that I worked with or academic networks, people I met at conferences. And when I was a trainee, the concept of industry was quite foreign to me. I had no idea what people are really doing in industry. I would attend conferences. Academics would be sitting on one side, the industry people would be sitting on the other side, and we wouldn't really communicate that much. So I think it's really important to break down these barriers and start communicating across the space. And I think that's basically already kind of happening. The lines are getting a bit blurrier. There's a lot of cross-pollination of ideas between both communities, especially when it comes to data-driven ML or AI approaches, resculpting the landscape of what's possible therapeutically. So I would encourage people to make those partnerships and connections, because a lot of working relationship depends on trust and getting to know each other before even initiating the work. And I think if you see areas of opportunity, then by all means reach out and to each other. And if there's a good connection, the industry partner would be more than happy to support and fund the work. But there are definitely a lot of complex legal and IP barriers, as Babak pointed out, and those in part are due to these university policies, etc. But hopefully we can forge our way through that as things evolve into the future. And just also want to mention the great opportunity as working as interns or co-ops, because when I was in my last year of PhD, I did an internship with James here actually in Microsoft Research, and that kind of opened my thinking into what life in industry is like as well. And now in this position, there are co-ops joining my team. We'll be opening up several positions in the summer and coming year. And I think those are other great opportunities if you've never experienced the industry to get an inside glimpse into how things are done in a different environment. Thanks.
I don't think I have too much to add to this one in particular. I mean, I will reinforce that I think what deters, people in industry from doing academic partnerships is the question of time, which often really does come down to the necessary paperwork and working with universities. We have had some, I think, productive conversations where we've managed to set up pretty informal interactions along the lines of, hey, do you want to try this? With a minimum of like real transfer of either money or IP. But of course, that isn't always possible. Internships can be fantastic. It can also be a little bit hit or miss, even within a company with a good track record of supporting interns. So, if you're considering that path, you asked a lot of questions about exactly how your time is going to be used, and feel free to have a high standard for what you sign up to.
Well, yeah, it sounds like a lot of you have found ways to collaborate within industry and academia on joint projects and publications, which inherently leads to kind of shared research output. I'm curious if in other circumstances you found tensions between the company's internal need to optimize your particular platform or therapeutic NIP with a broader desire to publish and share your research progress. This could either happen because certain projects are inherently maybe more procedural or less novel, as I mentioned, but still very critical to the company. But maybe the more complicated case is when you do work that is potentially more novel, and it gives your company an edge, but then also it would be useful to share with others. But maybe for IP reasons or financial reasons, it makes sense to keep that internal. I'm curious if you've encountered that and how you balance that.
I would say there's two main considerations. I think the first is protecting your IP. So before we publish or share anything, we have to go through essentially legal review at Shape. And that's fine. The lawyers are very responsive and very quick. But I'd say the bigger issue is time, because publishing requires doing well-controlled experiments, having good comparisons, nice figures, good writing. All that takes a lot of time and energy away from activities that are kind of more business critical at times. So there's always this tension between sharing and just getting the job done. And I think that will probably, based on my experience at Amazon, which is a very large company that has the market cornered, there you can kind of engage in more industrial research that's very, there's no immediate aim to it. But at a startup, I think the time and energy constraint is like a limiting factor.
I guess I could go next. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the tension is real. I think there are there is often a lot of appetite within the company, both the scientist level and often management level, for sharing work. And there are a number of strategies, I think, focusing on like the software and machine learning areas for that. It's often possible to keep internally at least a generation ahead of what you're disclosing. It's often possible to say, okay, well, we have sort of some infrastructure advances and we will share that, but we will not share sort of anything relating to our specific application areas within therapeutic development, strategies like that.
Yeah.
I'll go next.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I can say that, I have felt that in a really deep way. Industry is not only, rosy peachy. There are major issues as well. I discovered like some mechanism at a former company and I wasn't allowed to publish it. And 3 years later, it was published. And, to this day, I feel the pain. But, it's okay because, you win some, you lose some. But I've always, tried to open source as much as possible, to make available as much as possible. But it's a tough battle. Even when you are co-founder of a company, there are business interests and there are, other factors in play. So it's not an easy problem to solve. But my view on this problem is that you should always aim for openness, for transparency, for publishing, for sharing, as much as privacy laws permit and the non-scientific factors allow. But I think that should be the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I would also say that it's a very difficult and complex question that haunts me every day. But at the end of the day, I have to recognize, as a business, we are a commercial enterprise, and to keep ourselves afloat and succeed, we need a little bit of a competitive advantage. So if a business is not selling, there are no sales, then the money dries up. If there's no money, then there's no research. So that's kind of a vicious, endless cycle. And year to year, there could be enthusiasm by venture capitalists, or the next year there might be a down economic market, and there could be a lot of squeeze and pressure on what you can make available. And so my philosophy, kind of like Babak's, is whenever possible to try to share my code in an open source way that's free for at least academic use. We do have to usually put a clause in there saying that it's not free for commercial use, but at least we can enhance reproducibility and gain more visibility and into what the technique or methodology was to kind of lift all boats, hopefully, to progress the field. I would say arguably the hardest thing to do is share novel data, because that data collection process takes a massive amount of human labor, monetary and time resources to generating those data sets. And so I guess one compromise so far that I've tried to do is that most of my life, my career as an academic was built on reanalyzing public data. That's been a big passion of mine. And I think public data, it's kind of still a goldmine of information. So that's something that I've still continued doing at Sanofi, trying to model public data. And the path to publishing on public data is a little bit easier than on private data. So that's kind of the compromise I've done at the present moment to still show the progress of our work to the world. Thanks.
Great. Fantastic answers all around. So for the next set of questions, I actually want to take a step back, and I'm sure many in the audience can echo with me with the sentiment that the machine learning for CombBio is really evolving really fast, right? I still remember my first ML class Transformer, where I don't know what this thing would be, and then now they're all over the place, and people are using intro, I think even in the intro to CS classes, people are using things like Hugging Face all over the place now. So I think for the panelists, my next question is going to center around what kind of machine learning skill sets, as well as biology knowledge, do you think most prepare someone who wanted to work your company or your field at?
So when we were graduating, they told us that our degrees had a half-life. And I think that's true now that I've been in industry, but I think the half-life on your various skills is different. And I've noticed there's one skill that seems to have extremely long half-life, and that's math. When I was here, I took this class, Mathematical Foundations of Systems Theory, which was basically an abstract linear algebra class. And this type of stuff just keeps popping up over and over again whenever I read papers and try to analyze them. And so I'd really recommend taking the time when you're in school, which I think is the best time to kind of beef up your rigorous skills.
I think that's a great answer. I'd go even broader and say that critical thinking, in general, is the thing that's never going to decay. And I think one thing that looks like in the machine learning field is specifically critical thinking about evaluation first. So I think that's a great kind of story to be able to tell in an interview setting where you have gone really the extra mile to understand what a model is and is not capable of doing. And I mean, I think the other thing, it's extreme caution about leaking information into the test set, right? That's the kind of thing where you can lecture people about it, but until you personally have been bitten by it, you're not going to have that like paranoia that you really need. And this is something that, unfortunately, within the last 5 years in industry, I've seen a number of people, often not my coworkers, often instead people selling specialized services or consulting, make relatively elementary mistakes in this area. And so, like, the fundamentals, right? That's what's not going to decay.
Yeah, I mean, these are really great suggestions. I would say two things. First, invest in your coding. Try to be really better coders. Many of us haven't had formal software engineering training. Try to, learn some of the design concepts. It's going to pay dividends. It's going to help you so much later in your career. Try to write tests for your code. If you have a lab mate, ask them to review your code, give you comments, read other people's code. I think is the best way to learn, the concepts. Also, ML is AI ML. It can be a dangerous tool. I think the bane of our existence is batch effects these days. I've seen so many big companies go under because someone forgot to correct for one random batch effect. We had a poster yesterday on it. It's something that we pay a lot of attention. Okay, marketing wants me to call it confounder effects or whatever, but you know what I mean. When you get data from multiple sources, these models are amazingly rich and complex, and they can hone on them and they can learn them in a really, really malicious way. And the thing is that we would never know. I think, one of the panelists alluded to data leakage from training to testing. One thing we do, for example, at XI, is that the person who develops the model, they don't have access to the test data at all. And validation data, they have a budget. It's like Kaggle. So, they can run validation data maybe 5 times. There is a budget that we decide before starting the project. And, I will finish with this. Pay the proper respect to the baseline models. A lot of times, I have been applying deep learning for many years to genomics, but I am the first person that will start with a linear model or with a proper baseline. A lot of times good baseline models, really work well. I think there was a paper I saw that compared linear models with the new foundation models on single cell data and showed that linear models in some applications were actually better, or I think in most applications. We need to be really careful about this. And, as always, a good AUC is just a beginning. You have to show that you have earned it and your model really, is doing the proper job and is giving you a bona fide performance.
Great. Yeah, I'll add to that the type of team that I'm trying to cultivate is people who have dual expertise, that they have scientific domain knowledge coupled to ML and AI talent. And in my mind, it's not good to have only one or the other. There needs to be at least a little bit of both. And by domain knowledge, I mean deeper knowledge about mechanistic biology, gene regulation, molecular biology, RNA biology, classic bioinformatics and cheminformatics. But in terms of ML skills, would also echo what several of the other panelists have said about the fundamentals of classical machine learning techniques, rather than just taking a class on the top of the line AI or deep learning. There's a lot of hype surrounding these, but oftentimes in many scenarios, as people have said and shown in several great talks earlier today and yesterday, these simpler methods often have many advantages in usability, interpretability, etc. So I would resist the urge to train yourself only in the advanced techniques. And in many real world scenarios, such as data limited ones, they might actually perform more poorly, as several people have mentioned. So the domain knowledge is also critical in defining the metrics for performance and understanding the nuances of the data, such as how reproducible the data is. Are the error bars very large on the measurement? What are the limits of prediction? So you don't just get in that machine learning mindset that if I improve my R squared by 0.01, that is a breakthrough. Sometimes that doesn't matter. And sometimes maybe you're already training a pretty good model. So that is a little bit of a, not just a science, but an art form, how to approach those types of questions. So the domain knowledge will help guide you a little bit into that art form of designing the exact type of benchmarking that actually matters. Thanks.
Yeah, everyone's gone. Those were all really interesting and helpful answers, and also point to some of the skills and challenges that get emphasized it more in certain industry contexts where the focus is really about using the models you're working with more than just trying to get certain performance. So our very last question before we get to questions from the audience are, given all of this, what are the research areas that you're most excited about developing in the next 5 to 10 years, whether you're working on it yourself or have just kind of seen it bubbling up in talks over the past couple of days?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in real quick. I mean, my current company, as well as my previous one, I've been working on drugs to increase gene expression, and the first area of application for that is typically haploinsufficiency diseases, patients who lack, have only one instead of two functional copies of a gene. And similarly, with so many of the really advanced technologies around gene editing, around mRNA therapeutics, we're in the early stage of the development of those technologies, and it's quite difficult to get them to work. So you often want to use them to do something fairly obvious, right? In the sense of, if you can get it to work, it will correct the problem. But there's going to be a next generation after that, which is, okay, well, if we have these general purpose tools, how do we go in and do completely non-obvious and unexpected things to treat more complex diseases? And I think that modeling is going to have a huge role to play in figuring out what the correct way is, or what the best way is to approach those problems. Don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I think we have seen a number of talks in the past couple of days that sort of start, moving in the direction of really capturing much more complex processes at larger and more systematic scale. And I think that's going to be fascinating.
I mean, I work in the gene therapy space. That's probably obvious, but I think the one that it's really delighted me recently has been developer tools, or more specifically, ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot. I think GitHub Copilot has let me not focus on syntax as much and just focus kind of on the ideas when coding. And ChatGPT has been amazing for firing off emails that I didn't want to write, in addition to analyzing papers and like working through some math. And so I think as those continue to advance, I'm looking forward to doing less of the mundane work and focusing on more interesting work when I'm in my job.
Yeah. So, let me talk about something, maybe unpopular. Everyone is looking for LLMs that can answer questions. They are useful, but I think we need to think about an LLM that reads our papers and asks questions instead of answering them. And it should ask questions that probably we couldn't think about. I hope that, we can build them. I mean, my confidence in, for example, ChatGPT is periodic. Sometimes it gives a really elegant answer, and sometimes for very simple, questions, it flutters. But I would say I have been working and thinking a kind of a knowledge base, a system that can start by answering the major questions I have, because for every question you have to start searching. And I think a general GPT-like system wouldn't be good enough, because they really need to understand all these new papers and be updated. But I'm looking forward to the day that we have this question asking AIs.
Great. For me, it's a little bit related to what Babak was mentioning, but I'll try to take it slightly different direction. So probably many of us have been looking at the OpenAI drama playing out over the past few weeks, but one topic in my mind that evoked was kind of like the holy grail of the AI field for the last 60 or plus years. Everyone has been kind of trying to define, is it possible to make an artificial general intelligence? And I can't say that I'm working on this, but it's something I have my eye on very keenly, just to see that, how do I define AGI? Something that an AI that can reason, perceive the world, ingest large knowledge bases, not just use AI for pattern recognition with large data sets, but something that can actually reason and learn causal or mechanistic principles to generalize to out-of-domain scenarios. And that's kind of a struggle that several people in this conference were talking about, how to lead something to actually generalize to those OOD scenarios without being as data hungry as current systems tend to be. So to me, this particular space is really fascinating, and not just AGI, but really the confluence of it with computational biology as well. We're seeing an era where there's a mountains of public and private biological data growing exponentially year by year. And how do we actually make sense of that? Maybe an AI, like an AGI or something like that, if there's a breakthrough in the field, it could actually make sense of that and learn causal principles. And I view that as possibly, even if we don't invent AGI in the near future, the research going into that direction might still give influence into engineering novel proteins, small molecules, nucleic acid-based therapies that are still extremely valuable. So that to me is my interest in the next 5 or 10 years, just seeing the interface between AGI and the comp bio or therapeutics field. And so it's a very exciting time to be part of that and contribute just a little piece to it. Thanks.
Awesome, great. Again, just fantastic answers all around the panel. With that, that concludes our prepared questions. So we would love to open up the floor to any of the audience who have a question for our panelists.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a neurobiologist and a clinician, and recently got more interested in and also bioinformatics for a long time. But I'm interested in how you guys see biology background, machine learning background. Both are very technical, can take a lot of time to understand, and they're getting increasingly more complex over time. In your spheres of people you work with in your company, is it very divided? How is it split? Do you feel confident that it's balanced and people are understanding both sides?
I can take this. I think there was a time that this process was torturous. You had to. I didn't have good biology background, so I had to take a lot of courses, and do a lot of independent study. But I think the new generation of scientists, like, they are really they are very good coders, very good scientists at the same time, covering machine learning, biology, for example, many students from the labs of organizers of MLCB. So I think the next generation, or I should say current generation, they're doing really well. And honestly, I think you cannot have disjoint groups. That's why I am favoring self-sustained teams, as I call them. So for example, in my own team, engineers, computational experimental biologists are under one umbrella. We actually, before this, we had our weekly meeting, and I asked the team to help educate and elevate the level of competency of the entire team. A software engineer who's spending his time on bioinformatics and on computational biology, they should know at least to some degree what does RNA-seq mean and what are the limitations. Likewise, a biologist should know why implementing a simple change in the pipeline, why it initiates this cascade of operations and cascade of tests. So that has been my solution, to have a group of people that are working closely together and have shared objectives.
I guess I could go next from the perspective of being in a mega corporation, big pharma, as opposed to some of these other panelists. So in such a big organization, we have large teams of people dedicated to experimental or wet lab science. And then on the complete opposite side of that spectrum, people who are all AI, ML, pure digital. And then there's teams like mine that are kind of somewhere in between, trying to bridge that gap, communicate with both communities. And the biggest success is if all three of these functions are working harmoniously together. If they're working in an insular way, the experimentalists don't necessarily think in a very numerical optimization type fashion. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you're a pure AI, you might not understand the nuances of the data, where it's limited, these batch effects and other types of problems that might be prevalent in the data sets. So we need to all be speaking and communicating on a regular cadence, and try to digitalize all the information being produced and store that in hard drives in a way that's structured and organized, so that data engineers can harvest that information, and then people in machine learning community can actually analyze it and make sense of it. So I think it's really important that all these communities get integrated as much as possible for the success of the business. Thanks.
Yes.
So my question is about I think because I work with sequence-based deep learning models, so it's on that area. So I think so far the models that we have had, the large case models that it's not possible for academia to train, like Informer, like Borzoi. So they have been the weights and everything have been made publicly available, the training data. But if you think of the next generation of the models that will be trained, for example, something like big RNA, I think the model weights are not publicly available, right? So why, I think my question is if we are moving towards that trend where we don't make this model weights publicly available, how would people from academia verify whether there's something wrong in the model weights, and or whether they're biased towards certain things and stuff like that? And as people from industry being in the leading position, can you explain why is it difficult to make your models publicly available? Because you can literally put an embargo on that, okay, others cannot use it for commercial reasons. So why is it difficult to do that?
Let me just jump in with a quick point of clarification for big RNA. Although we did not release the code of the weights with the preprint, we are in the process of submitting that. The team is actually working on revisions right now to a journal for formal publication. And we do expect that there will be additional disclosure along with that. I don't know exactly what form it will take. With the emphasis that I'm speaking personally for this next part and not necessarily on behalf of TG management or the big RNA project team, I do think that it is necessary to hold the line on requiring disclosure as much as possible. And I think, a lot of the folks in this room from the academic and editorial side do have a big role to play in maintaining that community norm. Right? I think you're quite correct. So often without the fundamental standard does need to be genuine reproducibility, and without a disclosure of the model in the context of publication, that can happen. Now the question becomes more, okay, well, what happens, if we end up in a framework where people are training these models and then not going the route of traditional publication? And I don't know. I'd love to hear from my co-panelists on, what a good model for the future might look like.
So I would like to add something like, it would not be possible for us to build something and then compare against these models, because I wouldn't be able to make predictions on, let's say, a certain set of sequences we design and its variants, right? So I think it would become just impossible to know whether any model that anyone has built, whether it has built, it beats whether something like Big RNA or like Informer 5.0 or something like that.
Amen. Right, that's an important challenge, right? It's important that that capability be preserved. Anyway, I do want to let my co-panelists speak.
Well, for myself, I was involved in Informer and Borzoi. We tried our hardest to release all that information publicly. At Sanofi, it took a few months of legal review, but finally yesterday we released our codon BERT model. So we're trying our hardest to release all these models openly, freely for the academic community. We just try to put that little tag in the license for a non-commercial use to try to protect our commercial interests. But other than that, it could at least advance the academic literature. But some of these are big legal gray areas. So imagine making a model that's so amazing it could make your company $1 billion. Maybe it's not the best to release that model immediately. It might be great for academics and for the world, but it would be a very bad business maneuver for the company. So they need to protect their commercial interest a little bit. And even if you do release the model under that non-commercial clause, this legal gray space makes it very difficult to validate or verify if a competing company is downloading and using your code on a regular basis. So I've been talking to different legal experts, and that even people who are legal experts in the digital space find this a very gray area. Like no one really knows how to protect these types of models once they're unleashed to the world. And I think the tech community is facing something maybe a little bit similar. Google, for example, invented the transformer and other types of technologies like this, but then their competitors like OpenAI are now using similar technologies and competing against the big fish in the tech world. So it's a very complex space, and there needs to be some sort of balance between these two, I guess, and it's not always easy to define.
Yeah, and a lot of times, the privacy issues. For example, my former team at Google, they made this protein annotation, platform, and they made it public. It's now part of, Uniref, etc., Uniprot. But the thing is that, let's say we build a foundational model based on, RNA profile of, 10,000 cancer patients. So can we make this public? I mean, how can we guarantee that it cannot end in identification of patients in our cohort? We had the same issue at 23andMe, for example. How can you make sure that you are preserving privacy of participants and you are true to, the consent in the IRB? I don't know. It's like over my head. I think these are really complicated questions. But I've been thinking, maybe we can find middle ground solutions until, lawyers can solve it. For example, I think at Google, we had this option that, maybe we cannot share this model, but we have an automated system that will, apply this model to your data. And it's gonna, guarantee your privacy. It's gonna, run in an independent, container. Maybe we can provide, access like that. But obviously, if we can find a solution, we're gonna, seriously consider it. And if it works for us, definitely embrace it.
Great, fantastic answers all around. I don't know what to say. We can probably go one more questions given the time limit. Anyone want to do the honor of last questions from the live audience?
Thanks for all the great discussion. Something I've been thinking about recently of a difference between academia and industry is how collaborations between computational and experimental groups work. So, I haven't been in my faculty position that long, and I've already had this issue of what was overall a very successful collaboration with an experimental group, but we still ended up having this, I would call it a discussion, but it was, I think, technically an argument about who should be first and who should be last, because we felt like, the computational components were the main contribution to the paper. The experimental collaborators felt like it was the data generation. And so I think this basically comes down to, in academia, our careers are primarily judged by publishing papers. Papers have authorship lists. And somewhat, and that's just that's not something that's going to change, unfortunately. Maybe there's better ways that we would ideally assign credit of who did what. But yeah, I'm curious how you feel, whether that's something that you feel is a substantial difference, that because in industry your goal is getting to some product, getting to some therapy, and so it's not about who was last or first on a paper.
I mean, I can, so that's actually a nice thing about working in industry. Maybe the names on a paper really don't matter that much, but I think in terms of how we structure our projects and how we make decisions, there is definitely a tension between experimentalists and computational folks. And I'd say a big part of that is having just a mutual respect and having people on the experimental side that understand what are the benefits of bringing the computational folks, and I think vice versa. And I think that's one thing at Shape that we wrestle with, and I think we're actually pretty good at, is collaborating very tightly. So that means going to meetings together, talking, and not just sitting in separate siloed parts of the company. Because
I mean, paper authorship is less of an issue, but you can substitute in, I think, the separate question of respect, or more practically, who's really having their voice heard and who feels like their contributions are actually being well used, right? And in some ways that becomes even keener, right? Because it's okay, if you're in a situation where your organization is dominated by people who come from the other side of that divide, and they walk away from an opportunity and leave money on the table, or they have unrealistic expectations for what they need you to do, and it could have gone differently, and ultimately a project fails, a company fails, probabilistically, it changes the outcome for patients. It's a very upsetting experience. And I've worked in companies which were sort of more from the classical biotech mold, where the leadership had that kind of background. And in those cases, it can be quite difficult to educate people on what's realistic from a computational perspective. At Deep Genomics, we really came more from a machine learning setting, and the shoe has sometimes been on the other foot, where the biologists have things to contribute that we need to make sure actually really get taken in. So I mean, I guess the short answer is that you do see the same problem in a different guise, and I wish I could say that that didn't occur, but it's one of the challenges of doing work in this space, however it appears.
Was it David who asked that question? I can't.
Yeah, it was. Hey, Babak, good to see you.
Yeah. So, let me tell you a funny story. So we had a collaboration with an academic institution, and they sent us the draft, and we were somewhere in middle, and we didn't even have names. We were exi author. I'm kind of relieved that I'm not fighting those fights anymore, but at least when we collaborate, it doesn't matter that much for us, except sometimes you have younger trainees who really want to stay kind of in the publishing pool. I don't know. I think this is an old model. I wish we had a better way, because these projects that we are doing, some of them take 5 years. They are long-term projects. There are many people who are contributing a lot, and it's a bit unfair to kind of assign credit to who happened to be physically first or physically last, or as David calls them, first or last. But I'm glad that it has been less of a concern. And if you ever work with us, I can guarantee that we are very easygoing, and we usually make sure that our academic friends are happy.
Yeah, I would say same for me, that overall authorship has started to matter less to me than it used to, but I just still try to attribute credit where credit's due. Like the people who've spent a lot of time and energy and resources into it, they should be first and last, and when possible, share authorship as well. But that problem has been a problem since the dawn of time, even in academia, no matter where you are. There are many times in academia I was dissatisfied with my authorship, but the cards didn't quite play in my favor. But I would say arguably more important than authorship is just the protection of commercial interests and IP. And I think that that's a little bit more of a complex area. And as Babak alluded to earlier, there are many times when I'm extremely aligned with a professor in a different university, but then you get all the lawyers involved and the legal teams aren't quite aligned. And then something that's supposed to be simple quickly becomes much more complex than it started off with. So the organizational structure can contribute a lot to this complex IP discussion. Thanks.
Great. With that, I want to give us all our distinguished panelists a round of applause. And I'm sure they're happy to be reached, and you are feel to grab them when they're here in person or online via emails and other messages.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a nice thank you, everybody. Thank you, the panelists. Oh, sorry, Vikram, was that you?
Yeah, I was just saying thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. So this concludes MLCB for this year. Thank you for fantastic submissions, fantastic talks, fantastic questions. It went really well. And just one thing before you leave, if there's trash on your table, please throw those out so that we don't have to stay after hours here. David, anything?
Yeah, we will follow up with a survey. We'd love to get your thoughts on various things, including venue for next year. I think we have a choice of doing here or New York, so we need to figure out what people's preference would be. So, yeah.